to all our learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis is Inequality and Global Politics. Now, in this lecture, we shall try to explain how inequality is an important aspect for global politics. We shall try to elaborate on the definitions and various types of equality. Also, the lecture shall attempt to explain how inequality, namely the disparities, discrepancies in areas like income, wealth, education, health, nutrition, space, amongst others, have an important impact now on international relations as well. In this lecture, we shall try to look at inequality with reference to issues of distribution of resources, its impact on wealth and other dynamics, and the bigger picture of globalization, the global world, while analyzing the outcomes and opportunities. Dear learners, in the year 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, as we look at United Nations Human Rights Declaration, Article 25(1) talks about that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Now, to add to this, we also must take into account that Millennium Development Goals, yes, the MDG, it has the need to halve extreme poverty as one of its motto. When we look at from 1948 to rise of Millennium Development Goals, today inequality is a huge problem, and this inequality has a bearing with respect to global politics. Let us understand what do we mean by inequality. Inequality signifies state of not being equal, especially in status, rights and opportunities. As we take our learning forward, we must understand that the idea of inequality is very important for the concept of social justice. The United Nations defines inequality as state of not being equal, especially in status, rights and opportunities. We now have a look at a very important report. The World Economic Forum Annual Global Risk Report, and quoting from this report that how this report warned that downward pressure on the global economy from macroeconomic fragilities and financial inequality continued to intensify in 2019. The recent report, that is Global Risk Report by World Economic Forums, also points concerns towards inequality that underlines recent social unrest in almost every continent. Although it may be sparked by different tipping points, it could be corruption, constitutional breaches or rise in prices for basic goods and services. Global inequality has declined over past 3 decades. The report also points out that domestic income inequality has risen in many countries, particularly in advanced economies, and reached historic highs in some countries. Another report to ponder over to take our deliberations forward, the report is titled as Time to Care, Unpaid and Underpaid Care Work and the global inequality crisis. Dear learners, this report is by Oxfam International. This report, Time to Care, was ahead of the 50th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, namely when it was placed for deliberation. Now, this report points out certain important aspects. We read that out. The report talks about that there is a need for alleviation of global poverty. This report highlights how economic inequality has led to the greatest divide in the world. Now, what are the causes of that? The report tries to draw the attention towards the bigger picture of the system, that is, accumulated vast wealth and power into the hands of few rich. Then the report also presents to us some staggering figures. It talks about that how number of billionaires, for example, the world had 2153 billionaires in 2019. Now, this number of billionaires has doubled in the last decade, despite their combined wealth having declined in 2018. Now, with reference to concentration of wealth, the report points out that the world's richest 1% have more than twice as much as wealth as 6.9 billion people. Another important fact from the report is that of unpaid care work. The report points out that monetary value of unpaid care work globally for women aged 15 and over is at least $10.8 trillion annually. That is 3 times the size of the world's tech industry. Related to it, that is how world's 2153 billions have more wealth. That points out very important aspects once again from the report, that is the gap between the rich and the poor can't be resolved without deliberate inequality busting policies, and too few governments are committed to it. Now, this report, Time to Care, was ahead of the 50th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. This report is from Oxfam as we were deliberating. Now, whenever we are talking about inequality and we know that there is data, there are reports to point out how inequality is a huge issue with reference to global politics as well as for global governance. Now, we try to deliberate on the types of inequality that nations face. One of the most important type of inequality is the economic inequality. This means income inequality. This is primarily depicted by discrepancies, variations, differences in income. Next is monetary inequality, that is inequality in living conditions. Economic inequality, dear learners, as we saw that it implies unequal distribution of income and opportunity between individuals or different groups in society. Social inequality, to distinguish it from income inequality, it tells us that resources in a given society are distributed unevenly, and that could be based on the norms of a society that creates specific patterns along lines of socially defined categories that have different access to resources of power, prestige, wealth depending on norms of a society. Now, inequalities of various other types also. For example, vertical inequalities occur between individuals. Horizontal inequalities occur between groups. Inequality of outcomes, that is differences in what people achieve in life, namely level of income, and inequality of opportunities, that signifies differences in people's background or circumstance that condition what are they able to achieve. Another important concept with respect to inequality is that of global inequality, that is, differences in income between all individuals in the world rather than inequalities between countries. Other related ideas, that is inequality of rights and associated duties, it signifies a situation when people are not equal before the law or when people have unequal political power. So, what we get to know is in this discussion that inequality can exist in a variety of different spheres. It could be income, wealth, education, health and nutrition also. Now, with this we come to an important aspect, that is two prominent perspectives on inequality. Now, as we try to understand this, we like to point out that there are lots of reports by the World Bank, by United Nations, by UNICEF, by UN Women that have deliberated on these prominent perspectives on inequality. What are they? First, inequality of outcomes, that is, which includes level of income or level of educational attainment. Next perspective, inequality of opportunities, that is, result of differences in background, social treatment and conditions indicated by unequal access to employment or education. Now, as we are trying to understand inequality with a bigger picture of the global perspective, we take reference to this very important work by B. Milankovic, that is Global Income Inequality by the Numbers in History and Now. Now, this is a part of the Policy Research Working Paper, that is at the World Bank, Washington. It points out that inequality can be at different level. It occurs within countries and between different countries, either taking into account population, weighing or not. Global inequality, on the other hand, looks at differences in income between all individuals in the world rather than between countries, recognizing different levels on income or on inequality within countries. Now, as we are deliberating on inequality, when we look at the global sphere, let's understand what are the causes of global inequality. Now, some of the most important causes that have led one nation superior, other nation less superior with reference to the other, namely looking at discrepancies, namely looking at the aspect of inequality, the parameters could be access to health care, where developed countries have great amount of research, development, infrastructure of health care, whereas the poor countries do not have. The aspect of economy, that is the dichotomy of rich versus poor nations, namely with reference to resources at hand. The issue of political stability, human rights and equality. In some countries, the parameter of observance of human rights is more as compared to the other. Looking at the scale, the ambit of geography, when countries are having geographic natural resources owing to nature, and they are again on a differential plane. Some countries have huge amount of natural resources, whereas other countries face scarcity of resources. Another parameter of global inequality is that of education and access to information. Some countries have systems where transparency and information prevails, whereas there are other countries which are defined by lack of transparency in decision-making apparatus, and this also has a bearing then with reference to the issue of governance and development dynamics. Now, another important aspect as we are trying to deliberate on global inequality is that we take reference to once again a recent report by Oxfam, And this report, that is bringing together a world torn apart by coronavirus through a fair, just and sustainable economy. Now, this report points out that how a pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic has led to increase in inequality. Now, one virus has disrupted global governance. The virus has exposed, fed off, and increasing inequalities. Now, inequalities, once again, as the report points out, it can come from anywhere. It could be of wealth, gender, and race. Now, what we see here is that these inequalities, that is, rich recover faster, while recovery for the world's poorest people, perhaps it could take some time. So, what is of vital importance here? That how do we find out a solution, as this report points out, and we quote from that it is of vital importance of government action to protect our health and livelihoods. There is a need for citizens and governments, that is, they must act on the urgency to create a more equal and sustainable world. Dear learners, as we are looking at inequalities in the global perspective, another important phenomena which has a huge bearing with reference to the facts, the debates that are there with reference to the idea of inequality, the process is that of globalization. Now, globalization, if we go by studies that we point out an important study right now that we take from the World Economic Forum, the study by Sergi Basco and Martin Mestiri, that is, economists explain the link between inequality and globalization, World Economic Forum and Vox European Union, dated 20th May 2019. Now, this study points out that no doubt there has been large increase in both trade in intermediate goods as well as in capital mobility if we try to have a comparative insights, that is, before the 1990s. Now, after 1990s, global supply chains have emerged, a phenomena terms, if we borrow it from Baldwin, that is, new globalization is here. However, in this paraphernalia, one can also not ignore, as this report points out, a very important claim that is being put forward by several arguments also, that increasing inequality as well as loss of jobs, which points to an important link between inequality and globalization, looking into dynamics of developed versus developing countries, amongst others. Further, taking the debate forward, Luke Martel points out that globalization signifies integration of poor countries into a world economy of open competition. Developing countries open and liberalize their markets, but at the same time one must factor in that with this process of liberalization, following up of neoliberal policies and financial institutions, there was the debt crisis. Though globalists, when we look at the globalization debate, the globalist camp says that indeed globalization has increased poverty. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the argument, the other side, that some countries benefit from globalization while others are left behind with increasing inequality. Further, as we are looking at that, when we see that today inequality of opportunities is generally regarded as fair, while fairness of inequality of outcomes is more contested. Now, we are quoting this from this very important report from the World Bank, that is how today there is this aspect that is with reference to inequality of opportunity and fairness of inequality of outcomes. As to this, and this also tells us that how inequality is having a huge importance with reference to global relations. Quoting from another important report, and this is the World Development Report 2008, Equity and Development. This is from the World Bank. Now, this report also points a very important aspect, what the report pointed out way back in 2008, it is still prevalent today that opportunities are harder to observe and measure than outcomes. And they seem to be more a result of circumstances than outcomes which may arise from people's own efforts. Further, as we are looking at this debate on inequality, we now look towards to some solutions. We quote from this very interesting article by Muhammad Yunus, that is COVID-19 Fallout. We all know that the world witnessed unprecedented crisis with the corona pandemic. There were, fingers that were pinpointed towards failures in economic systems, in social systems, thinking processes that were being revealed. What is essential, as Muhammad Yunus points out in this article, that there is a need to redesign process that must create options for people. And the important idea here is reform of education, that is, producing life-ready people. That is when we have to look at economy that is a human creation to get things done according to their objectives. Further, as we are looking at the global world, when we are looking at inequalities, when we are looking at globalization and the debate with respect to inequality, a very important aspect with reference to how do we cater to reform of the dynamics of global governance, which shall indeed have a bearing with reference to finding the solution for inequality. We take reference to the remarks made by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi at high-level meeting of United Nations Economic and Social Council. Dear friends, this was via video conferencing on July 17, 2020. Now, the theme of this high-level segment of Economic and Social Council, which was on the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, was multilateralism after COVID-19. What kind of United Nations do we need at the 75th anniversary? Now, taking cue from this from the remarks made by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and we also take reference to the report that was there from the Hindustan Times. That is, we must pledge to reform global multilateral system to enhance its relevance, to improve its effectiveness, to make it the basis for a new type of human-centric globalization. India's calls for reform with an added emphasis on people, that is, to make dynamics of global governance more human-centric. So, dear learners, this was the lecture on inequality and its bearing with reference to global politics. We hope we presented you significant inputs and insights for the topic. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.